All right, today is December the 16th, and my guest is Terence Kealey. Terence is a British biochemist who was Vice-Chancellor of the University of Buckingham, adjunct scholar at the Cato Institute, and the author of numerous books. Terence is well known for his case against government funding of science, which made him an influence in the decentralized science movement. We'll talk about his views on the economics of science, the myth of scientific objectivity, and importantly, we'll talk about something that Terence has never talked about in public, a new project that aims to do it better. This new project is going to take place within the next pop-up city. The project is going to be a new research center on the island of Roatán with kind of a neo-medieval form of governance. Stay tuned to hear more. Welcome, Terence.
Thank you, Nicholas.
Great. So, Terence, do you want to give us a bit of a background on yourself and maybe also tell us a bit about how we came to meet and got to work together?
Well, we came to meet because you kindly reached out to me. My story is very simple, and people watching this podcast are not going to be very interested in me. They're going to be interested in the issues. So I shall be very, very brief on the subject of me. But the subject of me came up because in the 1980s, when I was working at the bench as a biochemist, there was a huge scare in Britain that the science in Britain was apparently going to be in decline. Mrs. Thatcher's government had cut the budgets for British science, and therefore everybody knew that British science would be in decline. What interested me about this, and I was working at the bench, was it was so obviously not happening that every time Mrs. Thatcher cut the government funding of science, the actual number of scientists in the universities I was working in, at the time I was working in Oxford and Newcastle, the total number of scientists actually went up. And this was so completely different from what we were told to expect that it got me interested in what the real economics of science really are.
Fantastic. And what was your experience the first time you visited Italia? Was kind of getting at.
Well, Italia was so exciting. I mean, all these young people, so bubbling with ideas, so open to ideas. I mean, you and I, we gave a talk. I know that's online. You chaired it and I spoke. And the quality of the questions, the engagement of these young people, it couldn't have been better. It was a lovely experience.
I think you were a bit too modest in your intro. Can you talk a bit more about the work you've done?
In the economics of science?
Yes.
Yes.
Your books and...
Well, there's a very interesting story in the economics of science that everybody who's not an economist should know, and everybody who is an economist should be ashamed about, because it reflects very badly on the economics profession. And it is significant that I am not an economist, that I'm a scientist, because I think, honestly, only a scientist, or at any rate, a non-economist, could blow this up, because it's a shame, really. So the story is very simple, and it goes right back to the Cold War. And basically, I mean, when I say basically, I mean really basically, until 1957, the American federal government did not fund science, except in wartime. So obviously, the Manhattan Project and other great projects in the Second World War were funded by the federal government. But the moment all that came to an end, the moment the war came to an end, those agencies also closed. So there was a big agency that funded the Manhattan Project, and it was closed in 1947. The American government reverted to not funding science. And so we have this extraordinary story that the most important economy in the world, America's, became the richest country in the world in 1890, and certainly has been the dominant country ever since in terms of technology and growth and wealth. And yet it got there until 1957, I'm coming on to 1957, without the government funding science. And the country the United States overtook was the United Kingdom, which obviously had the Industrial Revolution and the Great Empire, and all that without the government funding of science. The countries that did fund science in the 18th and 19th centuries, and 20th, of course, were France and Germany. And they never even caught up with Britain, let alone overtook it the way America did. And so the history of the last 250 years is very clear. The two lead countries of the last 250 years were Britain and America, where the governments did not fund science, and the countries that failed to catch up, I mean, they continued to grow, but they never caught up, were France and Germany, where the government did fund science. So that is a very interesting story. All that changes in 1957. In 1957, the Soviet Union, Russia, launches Sputnik, the world's first orbiting spaceship. And although it seems incredible now, at the time, there was in America what can only be described as panic, real terror. There was a terror in the United States of America that the Russians were going to nuke us from space. And this caused a convulsion in America of saying we have to beat the Russians in space. And so John Kennedy very quickly created NASA and a number of other projects. There was a time when the American government was spending 5% of GDP on research, an extraordinary investment. And America was determined to beat the Russians in space and to the moon. And they did eventually, though not immediately. I mean, Yuri Gagarin was the first human to go around space, around the world. There was a dog, that was also, so the Russians were still ahead until 1960 or so. But in the end, of course, the Americans caught up. So the point, though, where the economists come in is this. When the American government was doing all this, it had an ideological problem. They were copying the policies of the communist Soviet Union. And of course, they are a capitalist country. The whole point about America was they weren't communist. And so they had an ideological problem. How could they copy the Soviet Union's science policies without recognizing that Marx was apparently right? And so the call essentially went out to the American economics community, help us here. What we need are papers that say capitalism is better than communism in all respects, except for the government funding of science. That's the one exception. And two very clever economists, I use the word clever, not wise, clever economists, Richard Nelson and Ken Arrow. And Richard Nelson became the doyen of economists of science, and Ken Arrow won a Nobel Prize. So these are giants, did indeed come up with papers that apparently proved that governments shouldn't fund science. And if you're not an economist, these papers are very convincing. The trouble is, they are, and I'm not trying to be rude, I'm just telling you how it is, they are complete rubbish. Because what they said was this: we are economists, the paper said. We know that the so-called perfect market is the market to which we should all aspire. Well, if you're not an economist and you read about perfect markets, you just assume that economists know what they're talking about. Oh, what a perfect market is a complete fiction. In a perfect market, there's an infinite number of producers, an infinite number of consumers, an infinite number of interchangeable goods, and nobody has information that everyone else hasn't always got. That's called perfect knowledge. In such a market, there's a problem. It's completely fictitious. There are two problems. First, there are no profits. So, of course, this market is a fiction. And secondly, no one's going to fund science, because why should you fund science if you can't monopolize your inventions? Because by definition, there's perfect knowledge. So this is what Richard Nelson and Ken Arrow said. They said, we should all aspire to a perfect market. In a perfect market, governments don't fund science. Therefore, governments should fund science to compensate for the failures of the perfect market. And 99.99% of people went away thinking the economists had shown that governments have to fund science. And I'm afraid it's a confidence trick. We're all sophisticated people here. We don't believe in conspiracy theories. But this is the closest you'll get to a conspiracy theory written in the open academic literature, because the motive is very simple. If governments fund science, it means they fund universities. Whom do universities employ? Economists. The more money the government puts into universities, the more economists you have and the higher their salaries. I'm afraid it's as blunt as that.
Yeah, and then it didn't get abandoned after, like with the Manhattan Project. Um, so for the Manhattan Project, there was not this need for economists to justify it, right? And there was not this sort of by getting the class of economists to buy into it and to get like positions after from it. And so it seems to me also just this dynamic I find interesting. So that, government or state goes to economists or to academia to try to get arguments that suit their purpose, right? So John Maynard Keynes, for example, he said that the government should spend, right, in times of, a crisis, but they should then save again in times of peace, right? The government took that and says, okay, we're going to spend, but saving in times, no, we're not going to do that, right?
I'm afraid you're quite right. Maynard Keynes said exactly as you have said. And the trouble is, politicians are looking for short-term benefit. And so in America now, the national debt is well over the size of the annual GDP. And this isn't a good time. There is absolutely no excuse for this, apart from the fact that both Biden and Trump and their predecessors goes all the way back to George W. Bush. The last American president to try to balance the books was Bill Clinton. Thereafter, they've all spent money like water. And so, although it's absolutely true that the American economy is really thriving at the moment, there's no question. It's thriving because it's borrowing money at such a rate that this is a completely artificial growth. One day, the world will decide that America has too much debt and it's no longer a safe place to put their money. And when the whole world withdraws all their dollars from America, there will be a collapse in the American economy. Now, this is so obvious, so transparently obvious, it shouldn't need saying. And yet, 99% of people carry on as if somehow America has discovered perpetual motion.
Yeah, we had that topic on this podcast before. You also sound very much like Balaji Srinivasan, who's been talking about that as well. But we're getting a bit carried away. I'd like to go back to science funding and the arguments for it. There was an even earlier starting point that you talked about at our last conversation in Italia with Francis Bacon, one of the fathers of science.
Well, Francis Bacon was just like these modern economists. If you go into his life, he was the son of a very rich and successful man. His uncle was the chief minister of the Queen Elizabeth I. We are talking about the very early 17th century here. This is a long time ago. But Francis Bacon was an unlikable man. People did not like Francis Bacon. And so he kept on trying to get advancement at court, and people kept on pushing him down because they just didn't like him. And so he then invented a theory. He said, look, the one thing that Elizabeth I and later James VI, weren't doing is they weren't funding science the way the Spanish and the Portuguese were. And he came up with this theory, completely fictitious, that Spain and Portugal were the great dominant nations of the time. And of course they were. I mean, they were the first countries to create empires upon which the sun never set. Honduras, famously, of course, Spanish colony. He said it was because the Spanish and Portuguese governments funded science, and that's why they were so successful, and that Britain should copy, or England as it was in those days, and that he, Francis Bacon, should be given an enormous sum of money from the Queen and then later the King to distribute this money to activate British science, English science. The problem with the theory is twofold. First, it's simply not true that the Spanish and Portuguese invested in science. Of course, they had skilled technologists and skilled navigators and skilled shipwrights, but that's just part of the process of being upskilled when you create an empire. There was no lab somewhere with white-coated scientists. It just wasn't the case. But the other thing is that there's absolutely no evidence there's anything wrong with British science. I mean, the great scientist of the day was a man called Gilbert. We've all forgotten Gilbert now. But in 1600, when he wrote his book on the magnet, he was the cutting-edge scientist of the generation. He was the one who pointed out that a magnet was a compass. Rather, the compass was a magnet, and the Earth was a huge magnet, and that's how it all worked. He was the great scientist of the day. All this under private funding. So everything about Francis Bacon was untrue. And what's interesting about Francis Bacon, he made no impact in his own lifetime. It was only 60 or 70 years later, when the Royal Society was looking for money from the Crown, that they resurrected the idea of Francis Bacon and said, look, Francis Bacon has shown that government should fund science. It didn't work, by the way. The Crown saw through them. But this was purely self-interested on the part of the scientists of the Royal Society. And the sad truth is, Nicholas, that you can trust scientists in most things, but you can't trust them about funding, because when it comes to funding, they are shockingly dishonest.
Yeah. How did Francis Bacon become so popular? Because he's widely hailed as like one of the fathers of science in a way.
Well, because it was in the interest of the scientists, and of course because he wrote very wisely in other areas. Mm-hmm. I mean, he may not have been a great writer the way Shakespeare was a great writer, but at the time he wrote a whole series of essays that were very widely, very well received. He was a good lawyer. He had many fine qualities. It was just this business of saying things that the scientists wanted to hear that they promoted him. And of course, in France and Germany, they did believe him. France and Germany, of course, absolutist states under people like Colbert or Humboldt. And Colbert and Humboldt absolutely believed that the government should fund science because they believed that the government should do everything. That's the nature of being in an absolutist state. So one of the things they wanted the government to do, they wanted the government to do industry, they wanted the government to do agriculture, they wanted the government to do everything. And one of the things they wanted the government to do was science because that was the function. And so they drew on Bacon to justify that. What is interesting, and this is interesting, is that France and Germany followed Bacon, and huge government funding of science. What we had in England, later Britain, was Adam Smith. And Adam Smith, in The Wealth of Nations in 1776, very carefully dissected what Bacon had to say and said, look, it's just not true. And Adam Smith happened to be a very good friend of James Watt, the man who invented the steam engine. And he said, look, James Watt invented the steam engine and, by the way, invented the first law of thermodynamics while he was at it, simply in his workshop trying to improve the steam engine. This was completely different from the model of government funding of science. This was someone immersed in industry trying to make the next step improvement to a cutting-edge technology. That's how it works, Adam Smith said. We grow because technologists in the workshops of industry make the advances, both technological and theoretical. Adam Smith completely discredited Francis Bacon, and Britain after 1776, and America followed Britain in this respect, completely laissez-faire until the Cold War, except, of course, for the hot wars. But when the hot wars go, that goes as well. The trouble is we're still in the Cold War. We've really been in the Cold War with Russia since 1957. And you only have to look at Mr. Putin and Ukraine to realize we're still in that Cold War. And that continues to drive the military as well as the civil justification for governments to fund science.
Yeah. And just for our listeners to follow, right? So I want to frame this conversation as, so we're going to learn about the problems in science and science funding and how we do science today. And then towards the end, we're going to talk about a potential solution with the Roatán Institute of Technology. But to take a bit of a step back, because what you described right now with James Watt, for example, is not exactly what people kind of imagine science is. They kind of imagine people in lab coats doing experiments, writing them down, running regressions, writing papers. But what he was describing was kind of a tinkerer, right? So is there kind of a first principle view or understanding of what science is or what scientists do?
Well, that's a very deep question, actually. And there was a philosopher called Feyerabend, who once wrote a book called Against Method. And this is hugely influential. It's not a very widely known book, but in amongst the people who think about science, Against Method is a very important book. And what Feyerabend showed in this book is there is no method. His famous saying is that anything goes, everything goes. Whatever rules you try to make about science, however you try to justify one model or another, it's very easy to immediately think of someone else who disproves that model. So I think we should follow Feyerabend and say there are no rules in science because they can always be broken. The one thing we know is that in the marketplace, people are always looking for advantage. If you have 4 or 5 companies competing with each other, they will try to outdo each other, and so they will invest in research and development. I mean, look at the huge budgets Microsoft and Apple. I mean, we're talking about billions and billions of dollars these companies are paying every year in research. And these are vast sums of money. And so, they're not doing it because they're philanthropists. They're doing it because they want to keep ahead of the competition. We know very well that the men, it's all men, that the men who run these companies are not necessarily very kind or sweet, but they invest hugely in research because they want to keep ahead of the competition. And that's the motivation. Contrary to myth, the market absolutely rewards the person who is most inventive, who comes up with the best new product. And how you do that, there are no fixed rules. Sometimes it's a tinkerer, as you described, like James Watt. Never forget, all companies invest in pure science. All successful companies have about 10% of their research and development budget for pure scientists in white coats, in labs and benches, reading the journals and going to the meetings. Because it turns out that if you don't invest in pure science, you don't have pure scientists on the books. And without pure scientists, it turns out, just an empirical observation, you then miss out on all the great discoveries that are being made elsewhere that you need to import within your own company. So the market does reward pure science because it rewards pure scientists for being so clever and bringing in all sorts of strange ideas. And the classic example, I only mention it as an example, there are a million such examples, but Ernest Chain, who was the biochemist behind the discovery of penicillin, or rather the creation of penicillin, he was a biochemist. But one day in the Oxford pathology department, he just happened to be leafing through a microbiology journal, because that's what pure scientists do. And he picked up this microbiology journal and came across Fleming's description of penicillin. Fleming didn't know how to turn penicillin into a drug. Chain, as a biochemist, did. And so without Chain as a biochemist, scientists reading the papers of applied scientists like Fleming, the advance of penicillin would never have happened. Multiply that a million times. That's why industry funds pure science. However, what industry is primarily interested in is profit, very reasonably. And for that, you need primarily technology. But how you get to technology, whether it's from pure science or whether it's tinkering, and there are all sorts of different ways, everything goes. That's how technology, that's how business does it.
Mm-hmm. So you kind of described the way of science almost like as a societal force, or a force of business and of competition and of advantage. But you also said there's kind of these pure scientists, and they would probably say for them it's a search for the truth, right? Which is also laudable. And that seems to be kind of right now the more romantic view, or the more intuitive view that people in science would hold, right? How would you kind of adjudicate between those two?
Well, the trouble with the idea of the search for truth is it has become weaponized. What the searchers for truth say, and by the way, it's quite legitimate. There is no question. You talk to scientists. I mean, they're human beings like everybody else. They want a salary at the end of the day. They want fame. They want a Nobel Prize. They want to be professors. But these are all legitimate wants. These are just ordinary human wants. These aren't bad things. It's just that they're not saints. That's all. Nothing wrong with not being a saint. I'm not a saint. But what they say when they believe that the search for truth is legitimate and true. But they've weaponized that by pretending that only government will fund that. So what they say is the search for truth is very important, but only government will fund it. Not true. The search for truth is very important, but actually, if you look at 19th and early 20th century England or America, you have Charles Darwin. If you look at British science until the Second World War, look at all the great men and women Britain produced, mainly men, because that's the way the world was then, but women as well. And the same in America. All this produced onto the market. Who employed Einstein? Einstein was employed at the Institute of Advanced Studies by Princeton, who had an endowment from a philanthropist. The idea that without government, you wouldn't get pure science funded either by philanthropy or by the great foundations like American Heart or American Cancer, or the universities which have huge endowments. Harvard's endowment is 51 billion or something. Of course they can fund pure science. And of course, industry. And I'm just repeating myself because it's a very important point. There is a direct relationship in a company between the amount of money it spends on pure science and its profit. Obviously, there are diminishing returns. But if you don't spend 10% of R&D on pure science, you will eventually go bust. Put all that together, and the motive of pure science, which is noble and sincere, it's met by the market. You don't need the government funding. And I would go further. We now increasingly know that the government funding of science damages science. And the reason for that, the reason we have this replication crisis, the reason we have all these crises at the moment in science about the quality, damn it, the sheer honesty, or rather dishonesty of science, is because the government funding of science has done something very, very bad. There is a saying, it is technology that keeps science honest. So the model that most scientists believe in of government funding, the whole point of that model is this away from technology. It's called the pure science model. So government gives money to scientists. They're completely insulated from the market. They do whatever it is they want to do. They publish their papers, and then they move on to the next exciting idea. The one thing they don't do is engage in technology. This is a recipe for corruption. They don't mean to be corrupt. I'm not talking about bad people. I'm just talking about bad incentives. Because what happens under the conventional system, the government gives all this money to the granting bodies. The granting bodies are constructed of people who all believe in a paradigm. You only have to read the work of Thomas Kuhn to understand that scientists very rapidly form these paradigms. But they're very dangerous because what happens is you have a paradigm and then someone comes along and says, actually, I think you're all wrong. I actually think it's X and not Y. Well, they'll just say, we're not funding you. So if you want to get money from the government, you have to say the right things. It's a bit like the Soviet Union, ironically, because this is modeled on the Soviet Union. It's the same with papers. If you publish a paper, let's say you want to write a paper saying that global warming doesn't exist. I'm just giving you an example. I'm not taking a position here. But if you're skeptical about global warming, try getting it published. The journals aren't going to publish you, the granting bodies aren't going to fund you, and you're not going to get promoted at your own university, I can assure you, because there's a paradigm and everyone has to subscribe to it. That's simply how science works. The only thing that keeps science honest is technology. You can have all the paradigms you like in the world, but if your paradigm then makes you send up a space rocket, which promptly crashes, then your paradigm has been failed by technology. But if you're in an NIH with $51 billion a year to spend, and everybody agrees with you that fat, say, is bad for the heart, of course, we know it's not fat, we know it's carbohydrate, but for 30 years everyone said it was fat, then the only way you get your grants, the only way you get promotion, the only way you get published is by saying that fat causes heart attacks when it doesn't. So it has become corrupted. I repeat, not because the people are bad, but because the incentives are very, very bad. And that's why the government funding of science is so dangerous, because the whole point is to remove scientists from technology, but it's technology that keeps science honest.
Yeah, so we were just talking about public science funding and the myth of scientific objectivity, right? So there is a pure science, of course, there is a truth, there's objective reality, but it can get corrupted, right? So there is like paradigms that if you let pure scientists to their devices, they'll be very good at finding the truth embedded kind of in a competitive system, but left to their own devices as it's currently done or enabled often by government funding, they kind of converge around certain paradigms, and that gets kind of encoded in the funding organizations that are then sort of selecting the kinds of research that they think is fitting the paradigm, but not the research that is not fitting the paradigm or going against it. So with that background, what is kind of the track records of governments? And I'm asking because in the field of longevity biotech, we want to make a lot of progress, right, to end suffering from age-related diseases and things like that. And there's a lot of basic science that needs to be done, or so is often assumed. So what, and often there's very much a culture or very much the idea, okay, we need like a moonshot project by the government, like a New Manhattan project. What would your answer to that? Also knowing you have a bit of background on that, so some of those discussions.
Well, I have two reactions to that. First of all, government agencies can actually be quite reluctant to fund what they would see as lifestyle projects that may be a bit indulgent. For example, I just mentioned one example. Very famously, IVF was invented and discovered by two British scientists, Edwards and Steptoe. They couldn't get money from the Medical Research Council, which is the British equivalent of the NIH, because the Medical Research Council believed that was unethical research. And it was an ethical and moral judgment that they had taken. That was, of course, completely wrong. But they had a monopoly on government funding of science. They absolutely monopolized it. In the end, Steptoe and Edwards had to fund this research from their own pockets, and it was not easy for them. They were great. They were very great people at every different level, actually. Well, it's the same with aging research. There's no question that age-related diseases arthritis or whatever, or heart disease, will get funded by government agencies. Of course they will. But the idea of aging research, it's very interesting that we see this as predominantly being taken up by philanthropists and by very rich people, because they are free to invest in what actually matters to them. Just as women 30 years ago in Britain, if they'd had the freedom, would have invested in IVF research in the way that the government wanted. So I actually see aging research very much going to an appropriate home, which is the home of men and women of significant funds who are able to say, I want to fund this because I personally am interested in this, and because the NIH or government bodies won't fund it because they'll see that as frivolous or lifestyle when there are other things they could be inventing and investing in. So I think the move of aging research into the area of rich people is actually to be desired and is desirable and is appropriate.
And on the other hand, what would happen if we say with longevity, we get like a big lobby to advance or to get funding through the NIH and things like that? What would be kind of the advantages or disadvantages of that?
I would see that as primarily a disadvantage, actually. I mean, one of the things you want, this whole business of paradigms is so dangerous, is, as I said, this technology that keeps science honest, it's also competition. If you have different funding bodies, all following different ideas, you are much more likely to get to the truth, which you were talking about earlier, than if you have just one monolithic funding agency. Now, at the moment, we have in aging research, and I'm going to use the word billionaire as a sort of shorthand. I'm certainly not pejorative. These are people who've earned a great deal of money by very impressive work. But if you have a number of different billionaires all competing against each other, you're much more likely to, for example, I mean, take what Elon Musk has done in space. Elon Musk has absolutely challenged the NASA monopoly and has obviously come up with technologies superior by a very long way, both in terms of cost effectiveness and simple effectiveness, than NASA ever managed. Another example, of course, was the human genome, where it turned out that Celera, which in a sense was the Elon Musk of its day, Celera really accelerated, that's why they use that word, Celera really accelerated the mapping of the human genome because they set up in competition against the NIH and the NSF. I would be very unhappy if a moonshot was so successful that the NIH or the NSF devoted a huge amount of money to this, because what would happen is they would suck up all the scientists, all the best scientists would go to these agencies, because who doesn't want to be funded to do what you want? I mean, what happens in the government agency, the government just gives you money and says, do what you think is best. And so what will happen is they'll all get together in a monopoly, they'll all get together behind a paradigm, and aging research will be damaged. So what we actually want is lots of competing agencies and competing millionaires and competing companies, so that out of the competition, you're much more likely to get to the truth.
Yeah. Maybe you can describe the crowding out effect, which is kind of the technical term in economics.
Well, crowding out is a very real thing, and it's been well chronicled by my enemies, by the way, because, of course, if you go around saying that governments shouldn't fund science and governments shouldn't fund research and development, people don't like it for obvious reasons. And yet there was a paper that came out a few years ago, and they cited me. They weren't very friendly. It was actually quite a funny paper, in which they said, look, the truth is, and I can give a reference, perhaps at the bottom of the program, we might give a reference. The truth is, they said, these are the facts. They were very unhappy about the facts, but the evidence is very clear. But there's been a very interesting thing that no one has noticed. No one has noticed that over the last 30 or even 40 years, governments are no longer funding research and development. So there are two budgets. There's pure science, which is exactly as it sounds, and it's quite a modest budget. Pure science budgets are actually quite small. And there's research and development, which is the whole business of applied science, which is a much bigger budget, 10 times bigger, perhaps even 20 times bigger. At the height of the Cold War in 1964, when the model of copying the Soviet Union was at its highest, in 1964, 2/3 of all research and development in the United States of America was funded by the federal government. If you were a tool maker in Wyoming and you wanted to do some R&D, some research and development, so you could make the next advance in tool making, you wrote a grant to the federal government. Can you imagine such insanity? That's how much government funding there was in R&D. Today, the government is and this is across the whole world. The government's no longer funding 64% of R&D; it's funding only 20% of R&D. But of that 20%, half is for defence. So the government is only funding 10% of civil R&D, and it's primarily for global warming, space travel, and health, which are the things that most people want them to fund. So it's tiny. And what has happened, these are just empirical facts. What has happened is as the government has withdrawn from R&D, the private sector is funding 3 times more. For every dollar, for every euro, for every pound the government pulls out of R&D, the private sector puts in £3, $3, and €3. Why is this? Well, the reason is quite subtle, and we've published this, so again, we can make this available to anyone who wants to know. What happens is this: if all the best researchers are working for the government, and all the best researchers want to work for the government because it's the most self-indulgent work you can have, you work to your own targets, not to the targets set by the shareholders. If all the best researchers work for the government, then I'm afraid industry is reduced to working with second best researchers. That's just how it works. And second best researchers don't do such good work. So investing in them is a bad investment. And so when the government sucks up all the scientists in their own labs and industry is reduced to second division scientists, they reduce their funding in research and they put it in marketing or whatever, because that's the only way they're going to make a profit. And so it's called crowding out. And every time the government take the best scientists out of industry, and put them in their own labs, industry is left with less and less good investments and they go elsewhere. The classic example, no one ever talks about this, it's one of the great examples, was done by Senator Mike Mansfield in America. Senator Mike Mansfield was the Senate Majority Leader in the 60s and 70s. And he realized that what we now call DARPA, although it was then called ARPA, same organization, had completely abandoned its mission. DARPA or ARPA was always meant to be a mission of applied science. It was never meant to be pure science. What happened in ARPA and DARPA was that it got captured by its researchers and started doing nothing but pure science, and therefore produced nothing of any benefit to the military, which is what it was meant to be doing. So DARPA means defense, and it was always meant to be a defense initiative, a mission research. Well, Senator Mike Mansfield was furious about this. He said this is a waste of taxpayers' money. And so he cut DARPA dramatically so that they were only allowed to do applied science. So half their scientists were sacked. Everyone at the time said, this is the worst thing that's ever happened to American science. Senator Mike Mansfield is the most evil human being who's ever lived. We're all going to go back to the Dark Ages. What actually happened is all these people went to Silicon Valley, where they invented the modern world, where they invented all the technologies that you and I are communicating with at the moment. The mouse and all the emails, all these technologies we're using were all invented by men and women who had previously worked at DARPA, had been sacked, had gone out to Silicon Valley and created the modern world. That was the classic example of crowding out. The federal government had all the best researchers working for DARPA, and advances coming were not. Sack them, put them in Silicon Valley, give industry something to invest in, and suddenly you have the modern world. So this is what crowding out is. Crowding out is the government taking all the best scientists, robbing industry of the best scientists, and therefore industry goes off and does something else.
So where do you think right now is the most slack? Right, I mean, we have very big centralized public funding bodies like the NIH or National Science Foundation, but we also have large amounts of funding for research available. So where do you think is the most sort of, where do we see a problem? Where do we not worry about, and where could we make most, from a perspective of making progress in science and technology and having it applied and having it improve people's lives?
I have just finished a book Monday, 2 days ago, which is why I've not been very good on emails the last week or so, with my friend John Early. and we have submitted it to our publishers. We submitted it over the weekend. Our publishers are the Cato Institute in Washington, D.C., and we've called it Mission Lost. And we called it Mission Lost as in Paradise Lost or as in Mission Impossible. And what it is, it's a story attacking very viciously the National Institutes of Health, the NIH, which has a budget of 51 billion. And what the NIH has done, it has given up the original mission of being about mission science, has become largely an organization of applied science. It has so much money, it has become quite horribly flabby. Let me give you one example. If you go to, and you could do this now immediately after this call, Nicholas, go to the NIH website and look at what they have to say on the subject of obesity. You will find they have strategic plans, but they're not up to date. You'll find they talk about research. They don't mention the words GLP-1 or Ozempic or the whole advances in obesity research, which of course didn't come out of the NIH. They came out of Novo and the private sector. And the NIH has written all these programs and all these plans and all these strategies that don't even mention the greatest advance in obesity research ever. It is, or at least since bariatric surgery. It is a shocking self-indulgent because A, it's hugely out of date, and B, they're wanting to fund research that's now completely irrelevant, and it shows the NIH is simply not interested in the real thing. They're only interested in the self-referential. It is a real scandal, and you can extrapolate that throughout. So in our book, John Early and I come up with example after example after example, I mean hundreds of examples of projects receiving not just hundreds of thousands of dollars, millions of dollars, and yet no paper is ever published, no report is ever made. It's become flabby and self-indulgent. So what we have said in Mission Lost is the NIH should now give up pure science. It should just stop all pure science, which means the NIH will be hugely shrunk. It should only do mission science. So if you can think of a way in which you can improve obesity, say by developing a better GLP-1 analog, fine, although why bother? Because industry will do it for you. But that is all the NIH should be doing. And it should lose about 2/3 of its funding or even more and just focus on mission research. And all those scientists in the pure science NIH who will now be made redundant should either go to industry. And by the way, the American pharmaceutical industry spends something like 3 times as much on advertising as it does on R&D, and those budgets are ginormous. The American pharmaceutical industry could take every NIH employee and barely notice the dent in the investments that they would make, and we could then spare the taxpayer, but more to the point, we'd have all these great scientists now working for industry, where they would actually have to be creating new things like GLP-1 analogs rather than the self-referential work of the NIH where they don't even publish their papers. So the biggest thing I think that we can now do is, because the NIH is the biggest public funding agency of research in the whole world, is to strip the NIH of this, basically to be like Mike Mansfield, to take away from the NIH this huge fat of pure science, which is surprisingly unproductive. Take those great scientists, put them in industry, or some can go to the NSF, which is a much more efficient body, but basically strip them out and repeat what Mike Mansfield did all those years ago, rejuvenate the pharmaceutical industry in America. That's my own addition to the argument with my friend John Early. That's in addition to all the other arguments that people have been making about the replication crisis and all the rest of it. That's our novel contribution to that debate. Strip the NIH out of science.
Mm-hmm. For our listeners, what is mission research?
The fundamental difference between pure science and mission research is that mission research, let me give you an example. Mission research is the Manhattan Project. So in 1940-41, President Roosevelt, inspired by Einstein, actually, amongst others, said we should invent an atom bomb. So he didn't say, let's ask scientists to submit grant applications. Let's look at these grant applications and select the most interesting project. What he said was, we have a mission to come up with an atom bomb. And the person in charge of the mission was a general, General Groves. So this science mission was run by a general. He was no scientist. He was an engineer, but he was no scientist. But he knew how to manage projects. And actually, even under General Groves, there were people who were themselves not scientists. But the mission was to work out from all the published science out there the best route to an atom bomb and then to do as much research as was necessary, and they did a lot of research, but it was all about research towards making the atom bomb, and then you make the atom bomb. So it was mission research, because your mission is to develop an atom bomb, and then you do research in the service of that mission, which is very different from the standard model that the NIH or the NSF have, which is to say, send us a grant application and we'll fund the most interesting grants. There's no mission there. It's just self-referential research, and it's much less effective.
Yeah. Let's go back to that analogy, because it's something that people in longevity and aging often bring, like we need a Manhattan Project to solve aging. So, it doesn't, we already talked, okay, within the NIH constraints, that would not be a good idea. But is there a case for a Manhattan Project for longevity?
I would say there's a case for 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 Manhattan Projects. There shouldn't be just one. The circumstances of the Manhattan Project in the Second World War were extremely unusual. We were fighting a war for the survival of Western civilization against some very bad people. But for something like aging, we are a much richer society than we were then. There are many more people. And one of the things about old people is they tend to have all the money. That just happens to be a fact. And there are an awful lot of very, very rich old people who are particularly concerned with longevity. So let's have a number of Manhattan Projects. Let them be mission orientated. The mission is we want to improve longevity research. So the mission is there. Let there be 4 or 5. If one of them is funded by the government, that's fine, as long as there are 4 or 5 out there in the marketplace, or at any rate, philanthropic money provided by rich people. So let us have a number of Manhattan Projects for aging. Let the mission be very clearly orchestrated, which it is, and let them then compete against each other. That's the best way of getting aging research sorted out.
Love it. Very good message also for our community to try a variety of different approaches. Now I'd like to talk a bit about, we're coming to the end of our time, so I'd like to talk a bit about universities and academia, right? So we talked already that there are certain science monopolies, right, in organizations that just center around certain paradigms. When it comes to university and academia, you'd think, there's tens of thousands of them, right? So there should be more of a competition of ideas. And also there is loads of, during COVID, we saw there's loads of public health organizations in different countries, but it seems that there is also a clustering, right? Even different institutions seem to cluster around certain paradigms or truths. Why does that happen when it comes to university and academia?
Well, as we've discussed,
or another way of asking, what are the problems with science and academia today that lead us to do some of the things we're doing?
Well, they're a huge problem. I mean, you mentioned COVID. I can never pronounce her name because it's Hungarian. I'm not in any way trying to be rude about Hungary, but the brilliant, I think she won a Nobel Prize actually, brilliant scientist at University of Pennsylvania who did all the work that we needed.
Katalin Kariko, I think, right?
That's it. Thank you very much. Was she cherished and loved by the University of Pennsylvania? Did the NIH fund her? Did the NSF fund her? The answer to those questions is no, no, and no. In the end, she had to go to your country. She had to go to Germany and find a company to employ her, where she then made the great advances. And if you look in America, by the way, amongst the big pharmaceutical companies, the one pharmaceutical company that got there was the one company that didn't take the money from the government because they didn't want to be constrained by rules and regulations. So to answer your question, and it comes back to the original point, the trouble with government funding science and universities is this. Universities have 2 very great enemies. One of them is governments. Governments regulate them. Governments fund them in a monolithic way. Governments expect them to behave in a particular fashion. The other great enemy of universities, funnily enough, is trustees. Universities, and this is an extraordinary fact of history, universities were born fully formed and perfect 1,000 years ago. The Western world's first university in Bologna, 1088, so not quite 1,000 years old, but not far short, was born perfectly formed. And every move since the University of Bologna subsequently has been a mistake. If all universities were like the University of Bologna today, the world would be a much better place. And so what the University of Bologna was the world capital, or rather Europe's capital of law. And there are lots of young men, a sexist world, all men. Lots of young men wanted to become lawyers, so you had to go to Bologna because that's where the best lawyers were, and you would apprentice yourself to one of these men. And yet the students realized that they could be much more cost effective and easier if they got together, created a guild. Guilds are perfectly normal things in medieval Europe, self-governing, democratic, employ the distinguished lawyers to come and lecture to them. And that way they created an institution, which we now call a university, democratic, self-governing, no trustees and no government. That's how it was originally created, absolutely talking about the highest possible standards. They'd gone to Bologna, where they all came from all over Europe, because Bologna had the best lawyers. That's where you got the best research. And by the way, every academic should know this. Bologna is worth a visit if you're an academic for one extraordinary fact. In every other city in the world, you go to a public square and look at the statue, it's invariably a man who is a general or a politician, i.e. bad people. Go to Bologna and go to a public square, and they also have not so much statues, they have these extraordinary double-decker tombs, these medieval tombs that dot around the city. You're waiting for a bus, and there's this huge and enormous medieval tomb overhead. These are the tombs of the early professors. And Bologna was so proud of being the home. This is 800 years ago, 900 years ago. So proud of being the home of the first university that their public spaces are dedicated to the great professors and their lovely graves. So that's a marvelous city, Bologna. Now, I've forgotten the train of thought. You have to ask me your question again.
Yeah, I'm curious, actually, just to clarify, the originators of the model of forming a guild, they were inviting the best lawyers and lecturers to come and lecture them. So it was an organization basically by the students?
Yes, Bologna and also Padua and Montpellier, the very early universities, were basically created by the students. What then happens, Paris, Oxford, and Cambridge, is the academics themselves took over. They adapted the same guild model, but this time it was the academics leading. And but for horrible wars, Bologna would have survived as a student initiative, whereas Oxford and Cambridge would have survived as... Now, what happens today is this. Unfortunately, the continent of Europe, for the last 1,000 years, there have been absolutist rule, and the church, of course, very powerful and very cruel sometimes. And so all these early universities were crushed, whether they were created by the students or the staff. The exception is Oxford and Cambridge. England, just very happily, English Channel, no one invaded. And so Oxford and Cambridge retained the guild model. And each university has about 35 colleges. So there are about 70 colleges at Oxford and Cambridge, completely independent of the university. I won't bore you with the details of how these places work, but they are medieval guilds. There are plenty of guilds in the City of London still. So we all know in England, it may not be the same on the continent of Europe, but in England our medieval guilds have survived. And about the most active guilds are the colleges of Oxford and Cambridge, which are exactly as they were when they were formed in medieval times, run by the academic staff, self-governing. Now, there are universities that have since been created, run by the students in England. So the two most interesting ones are the Architectural Association School of Architecture, which was created by the students and the alumni who were architects, and it's a collective run by the staff, the students, and the alumni in a very happy democracy. Particularly relevant to Vitalia and Próspera, by the way, because one of their alumni of that school, Zaha Hadid, it's their partnership that has built your buildings in Roatán. So every time I see those buildings, I think of the great democracy of the Architectural Association School of Architecture, which is one of the great schools of architecture in the world. Another interesting example is the Royal College of Surgeons in Dublin, in Ireland. So although it says Royal College of Surgeons, so it sounds like a professional body, it's actually an undergraduate medical school, and it teaches medicine and pharmacology and nursing and physiotherapy. It's a fantastic school of medicine, one of the best in Europe, and it has trustees, but of the 34 trustees, 31 are consultant surgeons. And each of those consultant surgeons teaches for the college as well as governs it and takes students for secondments and all the rest of it. So it's again another democracy run by the staff and the students together. So we do get these survivals in England, or Britain, I should say, and they're very, very successful. Oxford and Cambridge are clearly the best universities in the world, much better than Harvard, Yale, or Princeton on a per dollar basis. Obviously, Harvard and Yale and Princeton are wonderful institutions, but they have so much more money than Oxford and Cambridge. If you look at the quality of Oxford and Cambridge and what they achieve on so much smaller budgets, they are clearly the best universities in the world. Why? Because they're run by the staff as a democracy. No trustees and minimum government intervention, actually, because the British government treats them with great respect. You have the same, funnily enough, in the world of music, just to give an analogy. So the world is full of thousands upon thousands of orchestras. They are all managed. But the three best orchestras in the world, by common consent, are the Berlin Philharmonic, your country, the Vienna Philharmonic, practically your country, and the London's Philharmonic Orchestra. And these three orchestras are about the only three that aren't managed. They're run by the orchestra, members of the orchestras, the musicians themselves, as democratic collectives. Isn't it extraordinary that out of all the thousands of orchestras in the world, the three best are the ones that are run like Oxford and Cambridge, like a medieval guild, as a democracy of the musicians? It's not extraordinary at all. There's a reason for that. It gives the incentive. And so, to come back to the question of universities, we need to re-empower universities to be much freer. There is no question that there's huge self-censorship across the university world. All academics talk about this terrible problem of self-censorship. And it's because they are terrified of the social media, of course, but they're also terrified of government and trustees. But look at Oxford and Cambridge. Very interesting. So, for example, there was a very bad man, and I'm not defending him, but it's very interesting to my story here, a very bad man called Rhodes, after which there's a country in Africa called Rhodesia, and he was one of the worst English imperialists you could ever meet.
Yeah, I know his story.
Yes, but there's a statue of Rhodes in Oriel College, Oxford, and all the workerati, all the liberal people, they demanded that his statue should fall. But the Oriel College said, no, we're a self-governing academic democracy. He was one of our great donors. Yes, of course, he's flawed, but he's one of our people, and we're not going to bring his statue down, and his statue still stands. And when the government in England, they were looking for an academic, a professor to champion free speech in British universities, who did they go to? They went to the professor of philosophy at Cambridge. Why? Because we had a woke Vice-Chancellor in Cambridge. I won't name him because he's a nice man, but he wasn't the right person to be Vice-Chancellor. He tried to impose a woke intolerance on Cambridge that you could only say one thing, and Cambridge is a democracy, and they just rose up as one and voted him out of office. And the man who led that is now the freedom of speech czar of the government. So the point I'm trying to make is the two universities in Britain, and I suspect the world, where there is greatest freedom of speech, just happen to be Oxford and Cambridge. And they happen to be the two universities that run as democracies. So there's a huge problem of self-censorship in universities, but academics aren't stupid. They aren't naturally censors. They're just responding rationally to incentives. They're responding to government pressure and all the other pressures and trustees as well. But at Oxford and Cambridge, those pressures are much more muted, and so you get much greater freedom of expression. And so, for example, to come back to IVF, just an earlier example, Edwards, who developed IVF in the face of huge official disapproval, happened to be a Cambridge professor. And in Cambridge is the one university where you're encouraged to do your own thing. And of course, there's a reason why Cambridge has won more Nobel. Cambridge, there are colleges in Cambridge. There are not just the university, there are colleges in Cambridge that have won more Nobel Prizes than France. Cambridge is a huge nest of creativity because Cambridge has this culture that men and women should be free. And so the answer to many of the solutions that trouble the rest of the academic community is lack of freedom, and Oxford and Cambridge have resolved those because they're democracies.
Fantastic. So with that background, can you talk about your vision for the Roatán Institute of Technology, your long-term vision, and also what's the first thing that's going to happen and who can sign up for it or should sign up for it?
Well, you have, or perhaps I should say we have, in a few weeks' time in Roatán, up to 1,000 young people coming to our pop-up city, our startup city. And many of those people are themselves entrepreneurs with their own startup companies. Others are venture capitalists looking for interesting opportunities. Others are young people, mainly young people, which is what makes it so exciting, who want to immerse themselves in this world to understand how that world works. It's a form of self-education. And then you have crypto. Basically, everything that says individual empowerment and freedom will be in Roatán in January and February. The sort of values that you and I have go all the way back to George Washington. Those values of liberty and freedom that English and British and American people love, they will be in Roatán. Now, what we are doing is there are three of us. There's me, there's Luca Turin, very famous for his work on quantum biology, very famous for his work on electron density mapping to understand how olfaction works. And the third one, a Greek called Makis, I can never pronounce his surname, so I'm just going to stick to Makis, it's on the website, who of course is a great expert. He works for the Alexander Fleming Institute in Athens and is a great expert on degeneration, aging and other forms of neurodegeneration of the brain. And the three of us are each going to talk for 2 weeks each. So we'll give a lecture every day for 2 weeks. So 2 weeks, 2 weeks, 2 weeks. And one of us, Makis, will talk about aging research, but in a very exciting way. I'll come back to that in a minute. Luca will talk about quantum biology, and I will talk about the economics of science. But we're going to do this in a creative and original way. So what Makis is going to do is this. He's going to say, look, which is an aging initiative. Here are hundreds of young people, each of whom has their own company, their own ideas, their own funding. Why don't we create a course to go alongside all the formal presentations so that we will find individuals creating individual companies who have individual ideas and ask them to speak, not to raise funds, but ask them to give a lecture as to what their thinking and science is. And we'll link them all together. Makis has to be a controlling mind. We'll link them all together. So at the end of 2 weeks, anybody sitting in on this course has learnt where the modern science of aging is today. And they will hear from all these different entrepreneurs, all of whom have created their own science, all of whom have linked it, and there will be disagreements between them. Unquestionably, different entrepreneurs will have different conflicting views, but that's called an education. And out of that, anyone wanting to know where the science of aging is in 2025 in the Western world today, go to Roatán and Makis will tell you. The other two sets of courses are slightly more structured. Mine is 2 weeks on the economics of science. What's very, very important is to understand that contrary to myth, the market has always produced all the science it needs, and contrary to myth, governments have only damaged it. So I need 2 weeks because every day I will basically be historical. How right back at the very beginning, you go right back to the beginning of humanity after the end of the last ice age. How did we first develop agriculture? So that's the first industrial revolution. It's an agricultural revolution. How did it happen? It didn't happen because of government funding, I can assure you, 12,000 years ago. It happened because, and here Jane Jacobs is right and the conventional story is wrong, it happened because men and women were trading together. They came together in towns and villages and settlements, shared ideas and invented agriculture. And that is the model by which science works, actually, by people sharing ideas. Contrary to myth, people share ideas because they get ideas back. And so right back from the early end of the Ice Ages, the very beginning of the New Stone Age, the Neolithic Revolution, and then I go through the Commercial Revolution, the Agricultural Revolution, I go through the modern world, and of course I talk about what happened in the classical world of Greece and Rome. I give this 2-week talk, and I show how all the economics of science is hugely misrepresented by the profession, frankly, for self-interested reasons. It's actually quite a crime, actually. And at the end of that 2 weeks, I hope that everyone will go away to say, the secret to science is to liberate the market, because this market is desperate for innovation and will fund it generously if only it's given a chance. And by the way, that's the way scientists individually can become quite well off. And why shouldn't scientists be quite well off? And it's also the way in which you get the best possible science for society because of competition, just like the market. And finally, Luca Turin will talk about quantum biology. Now, the whole point of getting Luca to talk about quantum biology, I'm going to be honest here, is that nobody knows anything about it. And yet it is clearly the cutting edge of biophysics today. It's clearly where biology is moving. And so I'm going to be sitting in on Luca's talks because I want to learn as much as anyone else. We have here one of the great cutting edge scientists, almost a philosopher scientist of biology today. We all know about Darwin. We all know about the standard stories of biology. But the future is this extraordinary. When I was a young man, the future was the combination of computer science and biology. It seemed very extraordinary when companies like Celera were created to fuse computer science and biology. That seemed very exciting. And it was something we all had to learn. But that's the past now. We do that routinely. The future now is quantum biology. And if you want to know where biology is going to be for the next 20, 30 years, you need to come to Luca Turin's talks. And at the end of those 2 weeks, you will know where we are. And I will be better equipped to talk this time next year because I'll have sat in on Luca Turin's talks.
Fantastic. Really excited, really looking forward to it. We covered a lot of ground today, Terence. There were so many rabbit holes where I was very tempted. Oh, I want to talk more about this and more about that. But that we have a lot of time when you're here on Roatán with us. So I also invite all of our listeners who want to continue some of these conversations and are interested to explore more. And also hear about this amazing program that Terence just outlined at the next Pop-Up City again, and join us. We're starting from January 6th, and we also have a sign up there to the school. The program, the Pop-Up City is for 2 months, but we're living here. We're building a permanent district. We also have regular builder programs for startup founders and for scientists who want to solve aging, who want to help us build a startup city and all those things that we talked about today. Terence, anything else you'd like to give our listeners on the way?
No, I think January and February 2025 will be very, very exciting. Sometimes one looks back at there were some key conferences at the very beginning of the 20th century when every physicist, like Einstein, and there were surprisingly few of them, changed the modern world in their conferences in Denmark and others. And I think that what's happening in Roatán, it's like those early conferences. We are actually changing the world. Just as people talk about AI is going to change the world, I think this dynamic is going to change the whole way we do important science.
I love it. Terence, thank you so much for coming on the show.
It's been a pleasure.